Internationally, adolescent girls from the age of 10 to 19 are the group most at risk of dying or suffering serious injuries during pregnancy and childbirth. In many countries, adolescent pregnancy often results in girls experiencing discrimination, abuse and economic hardship. They are forced into marriages by families hoping to avoid the stigma associated with premarital sex or the cost of raising a child. Now, these are some of the findings of the report entitled Lost Without Knowledge, Barriers to Sexual and Reproductive Health Information in Zimbabwe. The report was released last week by Amnesty International, and to discuss this, we are joined by Louise Carmody. She's Amnesty International's thematic researcher. Louise, thanks very much for joining us here on the program.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
The report revealing, obviously, focusing on Zimbabwe's demographic health data, identifying that nearly 40% of girls and 24% of boys are sexually active before they reach the age of 18. Is this reflective of basically Southern Africa, obviously including South Africa?
So the data varies across the region. We focused on Zimbabwe and specifically highlighted the age of 18 in this context because of legal and policy barriers that prevent young girls and adolescent boys as well accessing healthcare information that they need in order to help them make healthy choices about their sexual and reproductive health and futures. In different countries around the region, the policy frameworks differ. So this report that we've just released is very much focused on the context in Zimbabwe.
So if we look at the age of consent in Zimbabwe, what is that?
So the age of consent under the criminal law is 16 for a young person to have sex. But the reality is that for many different reasons, young people may be sexually active before their age. At the same time, in Zimbabwe, under the constitution, it respects the rights of a child as anyone under the age of 18. The difference in Zimbabwe, in contrast, say, to South Africa, is there isn't any legal or policy framework that very clearly gives children or young people the right to access healthcare information and services in relation to sexual and reproductive health if they need it. And that's created a context where there's a lot of uncertainty and inconsistency and contradiction, actually, around the age at which young people can access services. So, for example, one of the girls that we interviewed was 15. She told Amnesty that she'd been sexually active since the age of 12, and she thought maybe she'd had about over 20 sexual partners, yet she's never been to the health facility to get information or get contraceptive services or be able to protect herself from sexually transmitted infections. So that's the reality for a lot of young people when the legal and policy framework contradicts itself.
That is devastating figures, it really is. And I mean, when we look further into them, a couple of them that we've got on the screen, nearly 20% of Zimbabwe's maternal deaths occur among girls aged 15 to 19. And unsafe abortion is estimated to account for 20% of maternal deaths in Zimbabwe. Again, I can't imagine this is a situation that is just relevant to Zimbabwe. This is kind of ringing rather familiar for South Africa as well.
Yeah, so I mean, certainly our concern is around the vulnerability of young girls who are pregnant to maternal mortality and maternal injuries as well. Cases of obstetric fistula, for example, are thought to be very high in Zimbabwe. And that is a major concern because of the implications for young girls' health and their futures. What we've also seen is that Zimbabwe has made efforts to reduce the number of maternal deaths, and since 2010 that rate has declined by nearly 40%, but it's still 610 women and girls who are dying in childbirth for every 100,000 live births, which is staggeringly high and significantly higher than the rate in South Africa, which is about 140. And what's really concerning is, although we've seen that decline since 2010, as I mentioned, by about 40%, when you look at the data for how that's declined amongst young girls, that decline has only come down by about 20. That is significant progress, but we really wanted to find out why young girls are being left behind. And that's why our report highlights 4 key barriers. The one, as I've mentioned, is this legal and policy inconsistency, which means that young people are not able to get health services that they need and turned away many times because of their age. The other issue then is the underlying stigma and taboo against premarital sex, which is really driving some of these barriers. Yeah. So there's been a real conflation in Zimbabwe around the issue of child marriage, and it's sort of left sexual reproductive health out of that debate. What we're saying is it's important to separate the age of consent for sex and the age of consent for marriage, both of which are important interventions to protect young people. Yeah. But the age of consent for health services shouldn't be mixed in with that. It should be separate to allow those young people that need those services to be able to access them.
Absolutely.
And the stigma and taboo around premarital sex very much falls on young girls as well.
Yeah. And I imagine
with the other two issues that we've tried to highlight in the report is the importance of comprehensive sexuality education for young people, for boys and for girls. And our concern in Zimbabwe that is still taking very much an abstinence approach, where it's just telling young people not to have sex. It's not telling them any of the information that they need, for example, around how to have consensual, healthy, age-appropriate relationships. And that's a major concern. And then finally, we've also highlighted the context in Zimbabwe, which is very much related to the economic challenges that the country has. But although there's a policy for free maternal health care, that it hasn't unfortunately been really implemented. So adolescent girls who are pregnant find themselves in incredibly marginalised economic situations, and yet they have to find about $25 in order to register for antenatal care. So many of the girls that we interviewed either hadn't gone or had gone very late in pregnancy. And from earlier research that Amnesty International has done, including in South Africa, we've really highlighted the devastation that can cause, and obviously undermines the efforts that the country's making trying to reduce the number of maternal deaths.
Right, we unfortunately have to leave it there, but really thank you so much for joining us on the programme. Louise Carmody from Amnesty International talking to us about this research that was done in Zimbabwe, showing how adolescent girls from the age of 10 to 19 are the most group at risk of dying or suffering serious injuries during pregnancy and childbirth. To even think from the age of 10, 11, 12. It's something you don't want your mind to go to, but it is the reality of what is happening around us.